The hollow quarter woke before the sun did. Wren had always liked that about her home, if it could be called a home. The narrow streets were quiet in those early hours, before the merchants opened their stalls and the patrol horns began their slow, watchful calls across the rooftops. It was the only time she felt like she belonged to herself. She walked to the healer's hut with a basket of crushed root balanced on her hip, the same bitter herbs she used every morning to hide what she was. The suppressant paste stung when it touched her skin, but she had long stopped noticing the sting. What she noticed instead was the silence it bought her. In Varelia, an Omega without a name in the royal record was not a person under the law. She was property, waiting to be found. Wren had never been given a name by anyone but herself. She did not know her parents. She did not know the day she was born. All she knew was the healer, old Marin, who had found her as a child sleeping behind a grain house and had never once asked her to leave. "You're late," Marin said, without looking up from her work table, where she was grinding dried petals into powder. "I'm early," Wren said. "The sun isn't even up." "Then you're early and slow." Marin smiled without showing her teeth, the way she always did when she was pleased. "Sit, help me finish this batch before the soldiers come through asking questions again." The soldiers came through often lately. Rumors moved through the hollow quarter like smoke, curling into every doorway. The old king had died suddenly, and his son, young and untested, now sat on the throne. Some said the boy king would be weak. Others said he would be worse than his father, hungrier for control to prove himself. Nobody in the hollow quarter expected kindness from either version of him. Wren did not think about the king often. Kings did not think about her, and so she saw no reason to return the favor. That night, however, the king came to think about her more than either of them could have imagined. It began with hoofbeats, fast and uneven, and then a heavy weight striking the door of the healer's hut hard enough to rattle the shelves. Marin was asleep in the back room. Wren was the one who opened the door, expecting a frightened villager or a lost traveler. Instead, she found a man collapsing against the frame, blood soaking through a torn cloak, a sword still gripped loosely in one hand, as if he had forgotten to let it go. His eyes found hers for only a moment, before they rolled back, and he fell forward into the hut. Wren did not know, in that moment, that she was catching the king of Varelia. She only knew that a man was dying on her floor, and that Marin was too far away to reach in time. She dragged him to the low cot near the fire, cutting away his cloak with shaking hands. The wound at his side was deep, made by something sharp and deliberate. Whoever had done this had wanted him dead, not wounded. She pressed cloth against the bleeding and called for Marin, and together they worked through the night, stitching, cleaning, praying to no god in particular that his heart would keep beating. By the time the fever broke near dawn, Marin had gone to fetch water, and Wren was alone with him. She had been awake for nearly a full day, and exhaustion made her careless. She did not notice, until it was too late, that the suppressant paste on her wrists had worn thin with sweat and effort. The man's eyes opened slowly. He was pale, but alive, and the first thing he seemed to notice was not his wound, but her. "You smell like something I have never smelled before," he said, his voice rough. "What is your name?" Wren froze. She knew, in an instant, what his words meant. An alpha, especially one strong enough to notice her scent through exhaustion and pain, was not an ordinary man. She stepped back from the cot, pulling her sleeves down over her wrists, as if that could undo what had already happened. "I don't have one," she said. "Not one that matters." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze was not the hunger she had been trained her whole life to fear. It was something closer to wonder. "Everyone has a name. Not where I come from," she said quietly, and turned away to hide how much the truth cost her to say. He did not press her further that night. When Marin returned, the man gave a false name and thin explanation of a hunting accident, and Marin, wise enough not to ask questions that could bring danger to her door, accepted it without comment. He left before the sun had fully risen, moving carefully but steadily, his wound bound tight beneath borrowed clothing. Before he left, he turned back once at the doorway. "Thank you," he said. "I will not forget this." Wren did not expect to see him again. Men who passed through the hollow quarter rarely returned, and kings, she assumed, returned even less. She went back to her herbs, her quiet mornings, her careful invisible life, and told herself that whatever strange warmth she had felt standing near him was only the exhaustion talking. She was wrong. The man who had bled on Marin's floor was Cade Ashworth, king of Varelia, and he had not forgotten her. He could not. Her scent had followed him back to the palace like a memory that refused to fade, and though he told no one the truth of where he had been that night, he thought of the nameless girl in the hollow quarter far more than a king recovering from an assassination attempt should. He also could not stop thinking about what she had said, not one that matters. He had grown up believing that every person in his kingdom had a name recorded somewhere, a place in the world that the law recognized. He had not known that an entire quarter of his own capital lived outside that promise, unseen and unprotected, until a girl with steady hands and no name had saved his life and asked for nothing in return. Weeks passed. Cade returned to his duties, his council meetings, the slow and careful work of proving himself capable of the crown he had inherited too soon. The lords who had ordered the ambush against him were never caught, though he suspected several faces around his council table more than others. He said nothing. He watched, and he waited, and he grew sharper in his patience. Then came the announcement that changed everything. The Omega Registry, under pressure from the very council lords Cade distrusted, declared a new sweep of the unregistered districts. Officially, it was framed as an act of protection, bringing unclaimed Omegas under the safety of the law. In truth, Cade understood it for what it was the moment he heard it: a political trap. Several council seats required a bonded Omega to fill certain ceremonial roles, and forcing a sweep meant forcing new options onto the table, options the lords could control and use to steer the throne toward decisions that suited them. It also meant soldiers marching into the hollow quarter with transport cages. Cade did not remember deciding to go. He remembered only the cold certainty that settled into his chest the moment he heard where the sweep would begin, and the image of steady hands and a quiet voice rising unbidden in his mind. He rode out himself, against the advice of every advisor in the room, with only a handful of guards at his back. He arrived as the soldiers were pulling people from their homes, sorting them by scent, marking those who reacted to the alpha presence among them. Ren stood near the edge of the crowd, her suppressant paste useless against soldiers trained specifically to detect it. A soldier's hand had already closed around her arm when Cade's voice cut through the chaos. "Release her." The soldier hesitated, recognizing the king's face beneath the plain traveling cloak. "Your Majesty, she is unregistered. The law states." "I know what the law states," Cade said. "I am changing it. Release her now." The soldier obeyed. Ren, shaking, looked up to find the same man from that night in the healer's hut standing before her again, this time not bleeding, but burning with a quiet fury she had not seen in him before. "You came back," she whispered. "I told you I would not forget," he said. What happened next was not something either of them had planned, and yet it felt, to both of them, inevitable. Under Varelian law, a king held the right to claim an unregistered Omega on sight, a right meant to be used as a tool of control. Cade used it instead as a shield. In front of soldiers, villagers, and the frightened crowd of the Hollow Quarter, he claimed Ren not as property, but as his bonded, his equal, his intended queen. The court, when word reached them, was outraged. The council lords who had orchestrated the sweep saw their opportunity and seized it. They argued before the full court that a king who bonded himself to a nameless girl from the slums had disgraced the crown, that no true ruler would tie his legacy to someone without lineage or record. Whispers began, quiet at first, then louder, questioning whether Cade was fit to rule at all. Some spoke openly of forcing an abdication, replacing him with a cousin more easily controlled. Ren heard the whispers too. She heard them in the palace halls, in the servants' quiet glances, in the cold silence of nobles who refused to meet her eyes. She began to believe, in the quiet hours of the night, that she had become exactly what the lords accused her of being, a weakness that would cost Cade everything. She tried to leave. She packed nothing but a single bag and slipped out through the servants' passage before dawn, intending to disappear back into the Hollow Quarter, where she had always known how to survive. She made it as far as the outer gardens before Cade found her, his steps quick and urgent, his voice breaking through the darkness before she reached the wall. "Ren." She stopped, but did not turn. "You should let me go. It would be easier for you." "Easier is not the same as right," he said, closing the distance between them. "I did not bond myself to you because it was easy. I did it because for the first time since I took this throne, something felt true. You saved my life without knowing who I was. You asked for nothing. You told me the truth even when it cost you. I am not giving that up because a handful of frightened old men are afraid of what it means for people like you to matter. They will use it against you," she said, her voice trembling now. "They already are." "Then let them," Cade said. "A kingdom that punishes kindness does not deserve to call itself just. And I would rather lose a throne built on that kind of injustice than keep one at the cost of you." The council lords, desperate and cornered, made one final attempt. They demanded a public examination, a trial meant to declare Ren's claim invalid, arguing that an unregistered Omega with no proven lineage could not legally be recognized as a bonded royal partner. It was designed to humiliate her before the entire court, to strip away whatever legitimacy Cade had built, and to force his hand. Cade did not flinch from the trial. Instead, he turned it into something the lords had not expected. He brought forward the healer's own records from that night months ago, the notes Marin had kept of the wound she treated, the care given without knowledge of who the patient truly was. He spoke before the full court not of bloodlines or registries, but of the kind of person Ren had proven herself to be, in the one moment that mattered most, a night when she had every reason to let a stranger die, and chose instead to save him. "You ask what right she has to stand beside a king," Cade said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "I ask what right a kingdom has to call itself great, while it erases people like her from its own records. She has more right to this crown than any of you, because she has already proven what she would do with power, and she chose kindness when no one was watching." The court was silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, voices began to rise in her defense, not from the lords who had opposed her, but from those who had watched Cade closely since the ambush, who had seen the change in him, the steadiness he carried now that had not been there before. The trial ended not in Ren's disgrace, but in the council's defeat. Cade used the moment to push through the reform he had been quietly building for weeks, the abolition of the Nameless designation entirely. Every unregistered person in Varelia would now be given the right to a name, a record, and protection under the law, regardless of birth or district. Ren stood before the court that day, and, for the first time in her life, chose a name of her own. It was a small thing, a few syllables spoken aloud, but it felt to her like the first breath of a life she had never been allowed to claim before. Months later, on the anniversary of Cade's coronation, Ren stood beside him, as the Hollow Quarter sent its first free representative to the royal court, a woman who had once hidden her scent behind bitter herbs just to survive the week. Ren watched her speak to the crowd without fear, and felt something settle deep in her chest, something like peace. Cade watched Ren in that same moment, the woman who had once told him she had no name that mattered, now standing tall enough to be seen by an entire kingdom. He understood, more clearly than he ever had before, that keeping her safe had never weakened his throne. It was the very thing that had finally made him worthy of it.